This is Hellpoint, a sci-fi third-person action RPG that is very much going for the Souls-like label. If you've ever played a Soulsborne game, then the mechanics of this game will mostly be immediately familiar to you, as you can probably already tell in the background. So there will be some comparisons to the Souls games in this video because, well, that's clearly what they're going for, so it seems like a good point of reference. And you are dumped into this world as a spawn, a sort of immortal, inorganic vessel of life, on the space station of Iridnovo, where things have happened, and it's just kind of your job to explore and figure out what happened, who you are, and why you are. So let's get some of the more obvious mechanics out of the way first, the ones that will be very familiar to you if you've played a Soulsborne game before. First, there are souls. They are called axions, a sort of sci-fi particle kind of thing, that all the enemies and bosses and everything drop, and of course if you die you will drop those where you died, and you gotta go back and retrieve them. You can use them to level up at these things called breaches, which are your bonfires, that you can find at various points throughout the world. The breaches can not only level you up, but also be made to be part of a fast travel network. The interesting thing about this is they're not normally part of the fast travel network. You actually have to find a consumable item and they use it on the breaches. So that means you have to be very selective about which breaches you choose to be ones that you can fast travel to. Some of them will automatically be fast travelable. Oftentimes these are like story important ones after large boss encounters or something of that nature. But for the most part, the ones you're going to be finding in general in the levels are not automatically unlocked as fast travel points. When you find them, you have to find these fairly rare connectors and then use them. So that basically means you kind of have to explore around the area a little bit and then try and figure out if it seems like a good sort of hub of other areas, or if it seems like the kind of place they're going to be going back to relatively frequently for key items or finding locked doors and stuff like that. And then maybe select that one, choose it as one of the connected breaches. So that's sort of a neat little bit of a difference. These stats are pretty much what you would expect, very much like your strength, dexterity, intelligence, all of those, but sci-fi versions, and they all pretty much work exactly how you would think. And there is a pretty good variety in builds. The game is definitely smaller than your average, like, large-scale, huge action RPG. It doesn't have a tremendous amount of stuff. So, although there is a good variety in equipment and possible builds, you're not going to be looking at, like, a huge, like, Dark Souls 2 or 3 big experience. This is more like a Demon Souls kind of experience, or maybe Bloodborne, you could say, where there is just less to it. That doesn't mean that it's simple, and it doesn't mean that it's small. It just means that there is not a large, sprawling world with a huge amount of equipment and like dozens and dozens of armor sets and stuff to find. It's a more focused kind of experience, which is fine because especially if we're talking about a game that doesn't cost as much as a large AAA release and is sort of going for, you could potentially say, like a proof of concept by the developers to sort of prove that they can do this. This is like their first big effort. Then I think it's more reasonable to aim for something a little bit smaller and more manageable first, and that's definitely what seems to be happening here. Kind of like what the Surge did, effectively. And you'll be going through these areas trying to find, the next boss and the next major story event, just going through, and that's actually kind of where one of the first big differences starts. This game is actually, you could consider it sort of like the Dark Souls 2 world design, which is both a good and a bad thing, depending on your preferences. But Dark Souls 1 and 3 have a very directed area design. You go from area to area. There are, of course, side areas and things. It's not like a completely linear experience. There are optional paths and the like, but for the most part, you always know where you're headed next, and that actually is definitely a positive for the experience. It makes it very well paced. So you always have a very clear goal in mind, so you know what is the side path and what is the main path, and you have a very clear sort of idea of where you should be and where you're going. Dark Souls 2 was kind of like a more meandering, dreamlike adventure, you could say, where it lost some of that pacing, but in exchange it gained this sort of sense of just wanderlust. You were just sort of traversing around. You had a very general goal in mind, but there were often more than one area at a time that you could visit. There were like 2 or 3 large areas open, each of which were actually important for progression, and none of which were really a side area, and you just sort of chose to wander, just find out where you wanted to go. This, like I said, is good and bad because it means that you have a lot of potential choices. If you're having trouble with a certain area, there is more than likely another just as important story area that you can go to, but at the same time it means that the whole experience is less well-paced and less focused. And this feels like that. It is a more meandering experience with a more general goal rather than saying you need to get here and the whole goal of the game is basically centered around that. Instead, you're basically told right off that your goal is to just explore. You're supposed to find out what's happened, and you're not told to get to a certain location or to contact a specific being or anything. This basically just says gather data, find out what's going on, read stuff, fight bosses, go places, just do things. So that means the game is a very open kind of experience, but that also means it's not all that focused. So sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to determine where you should be going because you don't have that sense of cohesive, I need to go here, so I should go towards that location. And instead, it's more like, I wonder what's over here, and you just kind of continuously wonder and see what you find. Which, like I said, is simultaneously neat and frustrating at times, because it gives you this very nice sense of adventure and discovery, while at the same time, sometimes making it feel like you're not entirely sure where you should be. There are also some other pretty cool game elements that the game unfortunately does not explain very well, but we'll get on to that in a little while. So there are some differences to these sort of Souls formula. It doesn't wholesale take everything. There are some pretty important gameplay differences actually. For instance, a lot of games in this genre like to use an Estus-like healing system, where you have a sort of healing thing with multiple charges, and then whenever you go to whatever the bonfire equivalent is, it recharges it. This game does it a little bit differently, however. Breaches do not refill your healing item. They also don't respawn enemies, so you can actually clear out a whole area before a boss, go back to a breach to refill your health, and all the enemies will stay dead. The enemies only respawn if you change areas or if you die. Dying does refill your healing item and restore all the enemies and spawn you back at whatever breach you used last. But interestingly enough, just using a breach does not do any of that, so that's a bit different. And instead, your healing is actually replenished by attacking things. You have a sort of healing meter in the bottom left of the screen there, that big orange circle. And as you deal damage to things, this fills up. And at first you can hold 2 charges of whatever healing item you put there. You will start with a healing syringe. The interesting thing about this is it pretty much heals you to full no matter what. If it doesn't always heal you to full, it definitely heals a lot. I'm pretty sure it's like a full heal, so that's useful. I mean, no matter how much health you have, it's pretty much always a full heal, but you can only use it twice at first. So you'll be looking for the key items you can find to upgrade the number of charges this has. One interesting aspect of this is that the other consumables in the game, things like, how in a lot of games like this you have curative stuff like moss that cures poison, that sort of thing. Those are not consumables in this either, and in fact the whole Estus system is used for all of the consumables in the game. So you can find, for instance, an anti-rad injection. Radiation is basically this game's version of poison. And you can cure it with that injection, but the injection has to be put in this healing slot. So that means all of your healing and or restorative items use this charge system. And that's kind of neat. That's a bit different. It's a little bit restrictive, you could say, because you can't say have a heal equipped and like something to cure radiation. You have to have one or the other, and you have to use your very valuable charges on things to cure status ailments, which means for the most part you probably won't be curing them that often, because being able to save these charges for heals is much more important. But it's a neat idea, at least. You also have a sort of clock thing in the upper left corner. It's a little bit different when you're in the underworld, like I am right now. It's all purple and neat looking. But in the other bits of footage you'll be able to see, it's this sort of clock thing with a large sort of stone circle on it, an orange circle that rotates around it, and then these 2 sort of blade-like sections of it that are on the very left and very right of it. This represents the environment, and this is another large difference to a more traditional like Soulsborne formula. You are on a space station, so you are orbiting basically a singularity. There's this big black hole in the distance, and this represents the position of the station and where you are on it in regards to that black hole. And when the orange circle goes into those little blade bits on the very left and right of the circle, you are in what's called an Accretion Storm, and it sort of looks like a meteor shower outside. It has a bit of like a screen shake effect, and some other stuff happens, and apparently this can spawn things, demons, and these things called hordes that the game describes in its loading screens with a capital H, so they obviously mean something. However, I've never really seen this happen. I've explored all sorts of areas with this storm active, and I've never seen it make a difference exactly, so I'm not entirely sure what I'm missing. It clearly does something, but I haven't seen it in action yet. And when the orange circle and the stone circle overlap each other, that means the black hole is high in the sky, sort of like a full moon kind of effect, and it changes things. Supposedly it makes enemies harder. I think it may make them worth more axioms when you destroy them, and also it causes certain chambers in the game to have extra enemies in them and stuff. It can cause demons to spawn in certain areas and some other stuff like that, like secret chambers to unlock basically. These are a bit hard to find, but once you do find them, you'll sort of get the idea, and these are important for the story and things. So it's sort of a neat concept, giving you this like constant cyclical timed thing where these secrets can be revealed in certain parts of the station at certain times. It's kind of neat, but like I said, I haven't seen it make a huge difference, especially those storms. Based on what the game says happens, I haven't really seen that much of that yet, but I have a feeling that there's a lot more to be explored in some of the later game areas that may make this a little bit more obvious to me. Another thing that the game does not explain very well is the fact that each weapon actually has its own, basically like an experience bar. This is actually my favorite feature of the game, I think, because it gives the gear a lot more personality. You don't just get a sword, like every sword, gun, staff, everything has this experience gauge, and as you kill things with that weapon, this gauge fills up, and it gets new passive effects that upgrade the weapon in pretty major ways. These aren't small passives like 5% damage, they can be like drastically upgrading the strength scaling of a weapon, for instance, and making it way more powerful depending on your strength stat, that kind of thing. The sort of thing that you would get from like infusing a weapon in Dark Souls, kind of. These are like big stat-based increases. They make a large difference immediately. And also the very first, the very middle, and the very last nodes on this gauge, this experience gauge, give that weapon active skills that you can use. Melee weapons get things like something to increase its range and change its damage type, sort of like the bundles from Dark Souls, or something that makes each swing take less stamina and come out a lot faster, so you can enter like a fury mode for a short period of time with it. And this also extends to the firearms and the catalysts, which are basically like staves and just spell-using items, effectively. This means that rather than equipping spells in their own slots and then the catalysts to cast the spells, you actually just equip the catalysts and they each come with their own set of 3 different spells. This I actually like. I'm not sure if I like it more than the Dark Souls method of Vancian magic, basically, but I do like it. I think it fits the spirit of this game, and I appreciate that it's there because, like I said, it gives the equipment more personality, because you know that every new weapon you get isn't just a weapon with the same swing animations and everything as every other weapon of that type. It is its own thing that's going to have its own active and passive skills that will make it different, and I appreciate that, especially because some of the more advanced stuff like the crazy secret catalysts you can find that you're seeing in the background right now have some really powerful stuff later on that makes a big difference. And I definitely think if you're going to go for the whole like smaller form game with less overall equipment variety just because it's a more compressed experience, then I think doing this actually helps to make the equipment selection feel larger, because each different piece of equipment is very much sort of its own thing, kind of like how Bloodborne did it. You know, Bloodborne is not a game that has a massive equipment selection, but it doesn't really matter because each weapon has got its own personality and the weapons go for depth rather than quantity and something like that. And I feel that this is sort of this game's attempt to do something like that, to sort of take advantage of the fact that it is a smaller experience by making each weapon have its own sort of focused unlocks, and that's actually really neat. But this brings me on to one of the big overarching problems of the game that I've personally had, and that's that it doesn't tell you anything, almost. And if I had theme words for this game, they would be, I'm not entirely sure, because I find myself saying that a lot when I'm trying to figure things out. I'm actually not sure about some of the stuff in this game. The top left corner, you see the clock that I was talking about with the orange circle. There's a number 1 below it. What's that number 1 mean? I'm not entirely sure. Why does going to a breach heal you to full but not restore your energy? I have no idea. Why does traveling a certain distance from an area but not actually going through a loading screen sometimes respawn those enemies even though you haven't actually left or died, and other times not? Why does the data system act kind of like Insight from Bloodborne, in that the more of it you get, the other areas start to get more difficult enemies, new enemies spawned in them, and at what threshold does this happen? Why do some new enemies give you a new enemy bonus to your total data, but not other new enemies? Why does it only spawn you with 2 healing charges after you die, even if you've upgraded yourself to have more than 2? Why is it that sometimes after I die, the Axions I leave behind and need to go back and retrieve spawn way away from where I actually died, all the way across the level occasionally? Basically, this is a game that the more I've played it, the more I've enjoyed it. But it does not have a strong start, because it doesn't explain much of anything, and you often don't know exactly where you should be going. You have very little direction in terms of what your next goal should be, that sort of thing. It means that the first several hours of the game are just going to be you figuring out the mechanics. And there is something to be said about a game that has a very nice sense of discovery, you know, finding things out, but I also feel that there's something to say about a game that just doesn't tell you basic things that you need to know in order to play it efficiently, especially if we're talking about a game that's going in this genre, which is generally speaking supposed to be tough but fair. That's kind of like the theme of the whole Souls-like genre. Everyone tries to go for that. In my opinion, when you're talking about something that's supposed to be difficult, but you're also not telling the player all of these mechanics, then it starts to feel less fair because the player is going to die, and then rather than immediately hitting the ground and knowing what they did wrong and what they should try next time, they're going to just be confused as to what they did wrong and what they should be doing, and they're not really going to know. I think it's a very enjoyable experience, but you need to sort of sit down and figure some parts of it out first, because it's just so frustratingly tight-lipped on pretty much everything that a lot of the early game is basically just you trying to break out of the mold and understand what's going on around you, what the game expects from you, and what you're supposed to be doing. I've never been one to say things like, I swear the game gets good 5 hours in, or it really gets going after this point, because yes, I'm a very patient person, but I also feel that not everyone has to be as patient as me, and saying, I swear it gets good 5 hours in, is basically just saying to less patient people, I have to try something that I'm not going to enjoy for 5 hours before it gets good. And I understand that not everyone has the patience for that. I think that this game does get good. I think that once you've figured out some of these mechanics, the game really starts to open up, and you start to understand how this whole weapon active ability system works, and how the different branching paths work, and where all you need to be going, and the whole data system and all that. Once it all sort of connects, it gets to be a pretty enjoyable experience, but this game does not have a good start. It starts out very rough with very little weapon variety, very little enemy variety, some enemies that are just way too tough for how strong you are. If you can stick with it, if you're patient, and if you want to actually get farther into the game and see more, if it sort of starts to hook you, then I think you will have a good time playing this. I have so far. I would actually recommend it if you're into the whole action RPG thing, just with the clarification that this game does not have a strong start. It takes a little while, it's sort of a slow burner, and some of these mechanics are just frustratingly obscured from you in ways that I feel that they shouldn't be. The game just doesn't tell you enough about how some of its basic things work, and hopefully this video is actually helpful for that, because this has been like 15 hours of discovery for me, sort of condensed into like a 20-minute video, or less than that actually. So hopefully other people seeing this will have a bit of a head start on playing now that some of this stuff is actually, explained. But yeah, I think that it is worth a look. It's a bit rough around the edges. It's got some weird bugs here and there too. I've noticed some enemies like to spin in place for a while. When you die, sometimes your corpse like flails through the ground, which is sort of funny but weird. And yeah, it's also not the best looker. I don't really care about that much. I prefer, like deep and complex gameplay over pretty graphics, but it definitely doesn't look that great in terms of its overall visual style. And also important is the fact that this game is like half the price of your average like big AAA thing, so it's not trying to be one of those, it's not trying to dress itself up as one of those, it is like half the price. It knows that it is not this large AAA experience that can demand $60, it's actually like $35. Which I feel is much more reasonable. There is multiplayer. Apparently the entire game can be played uninterrupted in co-op, but I cannot show you any of that because the servers are currently experiencing problems. So yeah, you can leave cryptic messages to other players, composed entirely of symbols, by the way, which is an important thing. So yeah, Hellpoint is actually a pretty intriguing game, and I think that I would be excited to see what else these guys can do after this, because it's a nice proof of concept to show that they are capable, they know what they're doing, and there are some really neat features here, but it is rough around the edges, it is a bit frustrating at times, and it is not the most highly polished game you'll ever play, by a significant margin. So that's my views currently on Hellpoint. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.